endangerment. Originally, I had put these two lectures separately because I thought, they both need to be addressed. But then I started to think about the connections between having a global language and what that means about what does that term mean, global language, and also talking about the ways in which other languages might be endangered. And I found that they were very much interconnected. So the fact that English is becoming a very prominent language in the world may lead to other languages not being spoken and other languages dying. So we are going to get jump started here. I'll probably send out an email, but this week is also Mother Tongue Day, and it's a celebration to kind of appreciate and also recognize some of the languages throughout the world. And linguists like to come together to kind of talk about some methods of preserving languages. So just to get into, what is a global language? So a global language is a language with a special role. It's recognized in every country. Um, it could be a organization. So, for example, the UN has a set of global languages. NATO has a set of global languages. And the special role really depends. It could be a large number of speakers. So, English has a notable role in that it is the first language for a lot of countries, such as the United States, Canada, Britain, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Some African countries, it is a official language. So we have Kenya as official language. Some Caribbean countries is an official language. And other places where English isn't spoken as a mother tongue, but it is a very valued language and it's taught in the public school system. So you have places like Malaysia where you have official language use. So all the students need to learn English, even if it isn't their mother tongue or their first language. So there's many ways that a language can achieve this special role as a global language. Countries can either make it an official language policy. They could say, in this country, we abide by this language. All official documents must be written in this language. Or they can make it a priority, and that's done through the education system. That's done through a lot of the public sector, where we say, okay, so our native language might be this, but in and these discourses in politics or in law will be using this language. So a lot of people argue, is Spanish a priority language in the United States? And that could be something that is worth consideration. So an official language is used as a medium of communication. So this is used in politics, it's used in law, education, government. This is kind of top-down language use where the government is prescribing, okay, use this language. And it presumes that citizens will be able to master this language at an early age. English has the status in a lot of countries, 70 countries. Singapore, India, Nigeria, Ghana, Vanuatu, Rwanda. So this is places in which it has a official declaration from the government. This is one of our official languages. Now, this does not mean that every single country, every single citizen knows English fluently. So, for example, if you go to Singapore, English is one of four official languages, but that does not mean that everyone speaks English fluently, even if it's taught in the school system. It's kind of akin to Spanish and French here. You may have taking Spanish or French in high school or elementary school, but it does not necessarily mean that you speak it, right? And so, even if it has this official language status, it is not necessarily. You'll see citizens with a wide variety, a wide range of language fluency. So, a lot of people ask linguists and me, is English dying? Is English a dying language, right? Do we, is ESL really a primary function? And, as you remember, I got my bachelor's in English as a second language and English education. And, if you look at this map, this is a map in which English is used as a first and official language, and also countries where English is used as a lingua franca. So, lingua franca is kind of this, in absence of a shared language among the people, they'll use English, right? And so you'll see a lot of the countries that's prominent where English is used as the first and official language. And then here's a map of places in which English is the second most popular language in every country. And you see that encompasses more countries, and that 32 countries around the world use English as a second language. And looking at the third most popular language, you'll see that English also has a dominance here in 19 countries. So, in response to that question, is English dying? No, English is very much alive in that it is, if it's not the first language people speak, it's the second or third language people speak. And I'm sure if you were to run analytics on the fourth most popular language, the fifth most popular language, English might still be in the top 10 of countries all around the world. In looking back at, instead of saying what is the official language policy of the world, let's look at what's the official language of the United States. So, a lot of people ask this question, what is the official language? And a lot of people say, actually, it's English. But actually, we don't have an official language. It's a state by state mandate. And some states have English as the official language of the state, but we do not have an official language of the United States. So, by de jure, by law, we do not have an official language. But de facto, a lot of people would say English is an official language. That means like by all other contexts. It might not be by law, but if you need to go get your driver's license, you need to speak English. If you need to be enrolled in schools, you need to speak English. So this is not something to where English isn't just found in the United States, it's found predominantly everywhere. And you'll see state by state, there's a lot of states that require English and have done so for a while. And there's still a lot of states that don't require it, right? And they reject that idea. And so this kind of English only movement has been very political in the past. Because it represents a little bit more than just saying we have a shared language. I think it also represents the sense of if English is the official language, what does that mean for other places, such as Texas? And you'll see here that Texas is not an official English is a place where English is an official language, and that is because there's lots of migrants, there's lots of immigrants, there's lots of people who grow up speaking Spanish natively or other languages natively. So this is a very contentious topic in the United States. So back to English as a global language, not English is not really it's not spoken by people everywhere in the world, and it's not um, official in every country, but it is a lot. Okay, there's a lot of people who speak English. There's a lot of places where English is the official language, and I feel like this is will become more prevalent in the future. As far as priority languages go, priority language English as a priority language means that it's accessible to children. It's available for adults, right? And if you look at the world of ESL, it's exploding. English is being taught in foreign languages in more than 100 countries. Um, as far as the number one top learner of English are actually Chinese citizens. So the world of ESL is exploding. People will always need to know English. If you ever need a career choice, ESL is the way to go because this is something to where people will always need to learn how to speak it. And so, looking at this researcher, Kat Shrew, he and his wife came up with a circle of the global Englishes. So in the inner circle we have people whose English is their native language. It comes for free, right? There's little enthusiasm to learn other languages. You probably noticed this in the United States, right? And reading some of your linguistic autobiography, some of you are saying, I wish I learned other languages, and that's a fair reasoning because in America, a lot of people think that we don't need to learn other languages, and that's because Kachur would argue we live in this kind of circle, this inner circle or a bubble where English is widely spoken and it's a native language. The outer circle, is where English is a second language for a lot of people. And this might come from a colonial legacy. So, for example, you'll have a lot of places like Jamaica, for example, where English is the second language and it has an official status, but mostly people speak it as a kind of patois, and they really use English as in other domains. So they might use patois at home, but they'll speak, what is the prioritized official English in many of the public domains, such as media or administration, law, education, some of the legislative circles. And then an expanding circle, you'll have English as a foreign language. So this is places like in China, this is places like in Russia, where you'll have millions of eager learners who are ready to learn English because of its purposes. So there's nothing about English that makes it suitable for globalization. But some of the facts about English is that it has a lots of recognizable borrowed words, right? So, for example, if you're from South Korea uses a lot of English words. And if you're learning Japanese, Japanese has kind of a separate system to, how to incorporate borrowed words from English. It has a relatively simple structure and a relatively fixed word order. So I'm sure some of you who are learning other languages, you're kind of struggling right now because English doesn't have, for example, a gendered marking pronoun or gendered. Actually, it does have a gender mark pronoun. I meant like an article that you have to mark, or you have to conjugate some of your verbs, right? It's very, I could, English has I said, he said, she said, they said, right? We said. So it's grammar is relatively simple when we're talking about words that are not irregular. Um, there's no power relations encoded in the grammar. So, for example, a lot of you who are learning Korean or a lot of you who speak Vietnamese know that you can't just say the same thing to people. There's certain aspects, right? There's certain if you're speaking to a female, it's very different. If you're speaking to someone who's elderly, it's very different. So English doesn't really have that. You can kind of it doesn't have like a tu, versus vous phrase, right? So English is very accommodating to that. But also, I will argue that prepositions in English are hard, right? How do you know something is in the car versus at the car versus at the airport versus, spelling is a mess. There's way too many vowel sounds. How you spell in English is very, very, very different from how you say things. And its verb system is a mess. Everything is so irregular. And it's not so simple as putting ed at the end. I would also argue, being an English teacher, that English has a lot of phrasal verbs that you just have to memorize. There's really no way to get around it. And that makes English a very, very difficult language. I think if it was an easy language, a lot of people would speak it more fluently and we wouldn't really need to have ESL teachers. But the fact that it's very difficult, and you'll see a lot of the quote unquote misspellings, abroad. And that's because, this is a hard language to learn. So, what makes a global language? It's not necessarily about how many speakers, but who those speakers are. So, we're focusing on English today, but if you actually count the number of speakers around the world, the number one language spoken is Mandarin. And it really has a lot to do with the power dynamic, right? So you'll see a lot more Chinese people, Chinese citizens speaking or learning English, but you probably won't see a lot of native English speakers trying to learn Mandarin, right? And so why is that? What is the power differential inherent here? In the past, Latin was an international language, not because of how many people spoke it, but because of its power status. If you learned Latin, that meant that you're part of the intellectual, you're part of the clergy, you had some sort of an important role, and so it kind of carried a status symbol. There's other related factors as well: economics, technology, culture. How many of the articles on Wikipedia are in English? I would say probably a majority. I think Wikipedia is trying to do something now to where they're trying to expand on other languages. But when was the last time that you read a Wikipedia article in a language that wasn't English? So right, so this is, if you're only using one language as a means of information, kind of carry it back to our lesson on language and thought, right? If you believe that language influences thought and you're only speaking in one language, what does that say about the kinds of representation, the kinds of thought that you are producing? Global languages can be, the chief reasons for having global language are political power, military power, right? So we've seen these in a lot of, if you read about the history of Europe, you'll see that a lot of people, dictate, okay, you will learn this language. And it's a way to kind of manage people, it's a way to assert power, both politically and military. Um, there's also other important factors: education, commerce, entertainment, communication. So look at the kinds of media that you consume and their kinds of, kinds of lessons that you consume. Why are you learning it in one particular language, and not other languages? So, a lot of people use this term hegemony of English, and so hegemony just means that you have a overarching worldwide power, right? So English really started off by we have our cousins across the pond to thank for them, the British, right? So the British Empire was very, very, very successful in going abroad, colonizing lands, people, and they brought with them their language, and they were kind of the kings in industry and trade all around the globe. And as soon as they came to America, and formed the 13 colonies, English was already beginning to spread. By the time of the Industrial Revolution, English, especially American English, continued to be a driving force. So over time, it became less about the British Empire and became more about the economy. So if you ask a lot of people around the world, like, why are you learning English? A lot of them will say, because I want to get a job in XYZ, or I want to make money in XYZ. It's not necessarily I want to learn it because it's fun, right? Or to talk to relatives. It's mostly for economic reasons. So, English has a kind of linguistic imperialist standard. Will those who speak it at a first language, an L1, be at an advantage, right? So, for example, a lot of the conferences that you go to, if they're held in English and you speak English fluently and natively, do you have an advantage over those who don't? Similarly, will research publications in other languages be ignored, right? Because we get a lot of the bulk of our findings and our knowledge from publications. So if they're written in other languages that we don't speak, what becomes of those findings? And there's also, kind of a sense of linguistic insecurity. It's a question of attitude in society and not the ability. In that, a lot of people say, I only need to know English, I only need to learn English. Um, if you talk to people, a lot of people are okay with not knowing Spanish, and a lot of people are okay with not knowing Chinese or French or Japanese or Korean, right? Because it is kind of a power dynamic that English has um, over other languages. And so, if you see, this is an old map of some of the pigeons, right? These English pigeons that have occurred. And if you took my MLL 190 class, you'll know that a pigeon is kind of a language used that incorporates both the colonialist language and the host country. And so, a lot of these different pigeons, they've died, right? A lot of these pigeons have turned into, more of an official language of English. And so, this kind of shows just the broad reach that the British Empire had. They went to all these different places to colonize or to trade. And, this is how English kind of were able to spread across the world. So, what can stop this notion of a global language? Well, it depends. It could be a change in the global balance of power. So, for example, if everyone tomorrow woke up and they said, "Okay, you know what? We'll really earn this money, and you know what? We're going to communicate in Spanish now. Everyone's going to communicate in Spanish." Then that will, kind of change the global power. Um, you know, if there's a machine translation, so for example, if we're all, if ever Google Translate becomes just amazing and, we don't need to learn English anymore, people from other countries can just use Google Translate and we're able to kind of convey this while they're able to speak their language. Then that would be kind of a means in which maybe the preference for learning English can be stalled. I would argue though that this is probably not perfect because even with these tools, even with Google Translate, even if it were to become perfect, you would probably still need translators. You'll still need people who are experts, just because pragmatically, we talked about pragmatics on the first lecture. What you say isn't necessarily what you mean. So you'd be saying something in English and someone can translate it, but that isn't necessarily what you mean. So these are very different, and I really don't think English is going to stop being a global language anytime soon. Um, there's a really good quote that I really like that I found in the past year. It's from this author. His name is John Sopel. He's English, and he says, from the UK, and he says, "You see, if only they didn't speak English in America, then we treat them as a foreign country and probably understand it a lot better." And so the fact that, we have this cultural heritage from Britain, we can say, "Oh, we learned English from you. We have this kind of hegemony from you," right? I think the British people kind of resent it a little bit because their language has developed and our language has developed very differently. And so, this is when they look at when not I'm not speaking for every British person, but if they look at the English that we use, it's very similar, right? You just change a bunch of O's to OU's, and vice versa. But our culture is very different, right? And so, if we were to speak a different language other than English, um, we would be a very foreign country, right? And for the fact that we do speak English, it kind of there is a sense of connection, but it is a little still a little bit different. So, what do you think about other Englishes? A lot of their perceptions about other Englishes come from this uh, hegemonic history, right? So, for example, if you see someone talking with a British accent or a Australian accent or a South African accent, you would think, oh my gosh, like they sound so great, they sound so sexy, right? But if you hear someone speaking with a Singaporean accent or an Indian English accent or your Chinese English accent, a lot of people would say, um, oh, that's broken English, right? So how is it that, some forms are revered, whereas other dialects or other pidgins or other creoles are looked down upon or downcast, right? A lot of people think English, you know, are overused, right? So, for example, you might hear someone with an accent and say, they're speaking English, but they're not speaking my English, right? So there's um, a sense of claim and a sense of pride regarding an authority over someone's language, especially English. English gets policed a lot. So, some dangers of a global language is that it may lead to discrimination, right? So, if you're, you probably heard of, and you probably witnessed personally some instances of people coming up to someone and saying, speak English, right? When they're speaking another country, or sorry, another country, another language. So, this is a form of discrimination where because English has this kind of power, In the United States, a lot of people you really look down upon other Englishes, even though, like I said, United States does not have an official language status, right? And then it can also hasten the appearance of minority languages and lead to things like language endangerment. So I really would like to have you look at some of these examples of global Englishes. So I have three videos: Singaporean English, Indian English, and differences between Australian and New Zealand English, just to get a feel of some of the varieties. Because language is changing and the kind of Englishes that people speak are also changing. So this is the Singaporean English, Indian English, and Australia versus New Zealand. So let's talk a little bit about language endangerment. So language death, um, occurs very frequently. One language dies every 2 weeks, and I would claim that a lot of it has to do with, if they're not learning their native language, they're mostly switching to English, right? And so, what are the causes? Why do we care? And then what we can do about it. We'll talk about that. So, according to Ethnologue, there's about 6,000 languages documented, right? And, there's in the top eight languages, of course, the first is Mandarin. Others include Spanish, English, Bengali, Hindi, Portuguese, Japanese, and Russian, right? These account for a lot of the speakers, probably about 2.4 billion speakers. A lot of people speak these languages or at least one variant of these languages. But what about the other languages? So, for example, 96% of languages account for 4% of the people, right? So, you may or may not speak English or Chinese or Spanish or French, right? But other languages, you might be able to speak other languages that are not accounted for. So, a lot of people, it's kind of like the top 1%. A lot of people, speak these top eight languages, but then the majority of people speak 4% of, or sorry, 96% of the languages count for probably only 4% of the people. If you look at this map of Papua New Guinea, you can see that the language is very diverse. There's lots and lots of different languages spoken in Papua New Guinea, and accounts for 10% of the world's languages. Unfortunately, they are endangered. You'd see half of the population speaks one of 10 languages. Mostly everyone speaks of one of 300 languages, and only 5% of the world, 4% now, speak one of the 6,500 languages. So we are very linguistically diverse, but it all depends on a very small number of speakers. So looking at the language endangerment chart, most are safe, right? And by safe, we mean that the language is continued to be spoken and upheld in a lot of different areas. So, for example, they're being upheld in the home, right? So, even if English is the official languages in their country, they might speak Creole or something in Sierra Leone. So, but then also there's other languages that are becoming more vulnerable or endangered. And so we want to think about languages the same way we want to think about like animals being endangered, right? So like pandas being endangered, right? A lot of people see images of pandas dying, and they're like, oh my gosh, these pandas are dying. What can we help? How can I help? How can I give money? How can I donate? But when a language dies, people don't really give the kind of attention that it deserves, right? So when we talk about language death, this is when the last speaker dies, or the second to last, right? Because if you don't have someone to communicate with in that language, then it starts to die. So languages could shift in that communities could adopt new languages. And like I said, a language dies every 2 weeks. Cross estimates that there's closer to 5,000 language deaths, and that we've had so many languages die. So there's lots of reasons why languages die. There could be some physical dangers, right? So for example, um, if an entire community is lost to natural disasters or disease, then they are forced to die. If there's a political conflict, and someone who wins says, you only should speak this language, then that's how a language is quelled. There could also be some cultural factors. For example, assimilation. A lot of people who are immigrants who move to the United States, like they want their kids to be speaking English, and so as a result, they lose their heritage language by the second generation because they want that assimilation to society, right, or their host country. Military dominance, urbanization, media, bilingualism, right? So the media that you're consuming is not in your native language. You're less likely to kind of keep up that language, right? So we'll be giving you examples of some of these language deaths. So, like I said, a language can die suddenly when all of its speakers are killed. So, for example, in Tasmania, there's an awful, awful history of genocide where, people try to wipe out huge numbers of people, and as a result, their language is killed as well. Nicoleño is a Native American language. It's spoken off of an island, I think, like around off of California, and their people got wiped out. I think they ate sea turtles or something, and so when all the sea turtles got extinct, they also died. There's a language spoken in a village in Brazil, but then the flu came, and then the flu killed everybody. So then, we don't have a language anymore because it really takes a group of people to be able to speak a language. So these are radical language deaths. This is not necessarily suddenly, because of a natural disaster, but some speakers might choose to stop speaking their language out of political repression, right? So many Native American languages were this way. Native American languages have kind of a long history in which, they had a long history in which they were being sent to a lot of, language camps. So you would have these Native Americans that were instructed to not speak their language, and so on fear of death, so they kind of gradually lost their language this way. There's an uprising in El Salvador, killing the peasants, right? And so, the Linca and the Cacoperos Spera stopped using their languages because they didn't want to be killed, right? And so that's a good reason not to speak their languages. And like I said earlier, if you, are a political group and you're trying to enact genocide, or if you're trying to make sure the people that you've conquered will follow your laws, then one way to do that is to get rid of their language because it's a sense of their identity, right? So you're stripping them away of their identity. Gradual language death. So this happens just like fewer and fewer children learn the language because children are the torches, right? They hold the languages for the next generation. So Cornish was widely spoken in Britain in the 1700s. It's not spoken anymore. Again, lots of Native American languages, right? You'll see very few people who speak it natively. Give you an example from past lectures. The Cherokee, right? The Cherokee, fewer and fewer speakers, and we'll talk about how they're able to revitalize their language in just a little bit. It could be a bottom to top language death, in that the language is kind of used in specific context. So the language is dead, but it's still used. So for example, Latin, right? So Latin, no one speaks Latin fluently, but Latin you still need to learn it for law, or if some of you probably took Latin in high school, right? It's used as a class. So we would say that the language is dead, but in some cases it's still very much alive. Like Latin will still be a necessary part because it influences so many of the languages that we have. Hebrew in the past was a specifically liturgical language. It was only used to read the Torah and other religious texts, and now it's a native language for a lot of people in Israel and a lot of people in the United States. So talking about the shift factor, so looking at why language shifts. So there's benefits of learning a second language. Economic to make money. Like I said, a lot of English speakers are not doing it because it's cool. A lot of people are doing it because it's to make money. A lot of it could be political, so they want to have power, right? And the best way to have power is to learn a particular language, or it could have some social benefits. So, a lot of people learn French, or they say they're learning French because it sounds cool, right? They want to go to Paris and they want to be able to speak to native French speakers, right? So it's like a cool language. And this is, of course, socially derived. It's nothing about French linguistically that makes it cool. I think all languages are cool linguistically, but bilingualism is an early indicator of language shift. So when you teach your children to speak a certain language, that creates a bilingual student, but not always, because there's some indications, and I probably read this in your linguistic autobiography, where you grow up learning a language and then you kind of lose it, right? So languages do have this unfortunate use or lose kind of method in which, if you grew up speaking a certain language, but then you didn't practice it as an adult, or you grew up and you only know how to use languages in a certain domain, like to talk about the home, but not talk, for cuss words and for foods, right? But you don't really use languages in any other aspects, then you're not really going to learn the language. The shift sometimes is inevitable, right? So communities will shift without maintenance. There could be something political that's happened. There could be something where, they have lots of pride, right? So a lot of people, you might have German ancestry, or Italian ancestry, but at the time in America, when your grandparents came, or great grandparents came, it was very hard to speak Italian or speak German. Like, people look down upon you, and people, you know, um, really discriminated against you. So you wanted to learn English and be American as much as possible. So this could happen. The youngest speakers are most likely to shift. That is why it's very, very, very important, if you want to maintain a language, is to focus on the youngest speakers. Not to say that adults can't learn a language and you shouldn't teach adults the language, but the youngest generation will be parents of the next generation, and they, like I said, hold the torches for language revitalization for the next generation. So there could be some demographic shift factors. If you move to America and you are the only family that speak your language, you probably lose it. The social isolation, is something that influences shift. Larger, minority groups and rural groups are less likely to change. The size of the community might have an impact on language shift. So a large community means slower shift. And that's because you have more community resources. So, for example, if you grew up Chinese American in rural North Carolina, you didn't really have a lot of Chinese speaking resources, right? But if you grew up in California, if you grew up in New York, if you grew up in a Chinatown, right, you probably had a lot of resources. You probably get to speak your language every day. Probably got to go to Chinese school, right? And that's not really an option for a lot of people. But yeah, in the community, there's more social pressure. Your parents put you in Chinese school. Your parents, have only media, Chinese media or Korean media, right? And so if you don't have these kinds of reinforcements from your communities, it's very difficult to maintain the language. Intermarriage might be, accelerate the shift to the language of the majority. So for some of you in your linguistic autobiography, you said, my mom is from this place or my dad is from this place, right? So, if you speak a language and you want to maintain that language, it's gonna be very hard if you don't have a partner who speaks the same language. But research has shown that, if it's the mom's language, mothers can slow down language shifts because mothers are very intensely um, involved in their children's lives, and they seek out opportunities for this for language engagement. I would also say that fathers are very intensely engaged. So, for example, I'm doing research right now on parents who put their kids in Mandarin English schools, and the fathers are very actively involved. So, I don't know why the research focuses on mothers. I guess like mothers have been more um, interviewed in the past, but fathers do serve a role um, in facilitating language. So there could be a cultural shift values. A low value to language leads to a faster shift. So, for example, if people look down on you for speaking Spanish, right, in your area, then you probably wouldn't want to speak Spanish. But if you live in places where Spanish is the norm, California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, this is something to where, yeah, you'll keep your Spanish, right, because this is something to where you have a high value of the language depending on where you're from. And the stronger ties you have with your identity also slows down. So if you have Germanic roots, and you're very very closely identified with your Germanic roots or your Polish roots, you're more likely to delay a language shift and to kind of maintain it a little bit longer. International status slows down and shifts. So, for example, French usage in United States and in Canada. So, in parts of Louisiana, they'll speak a kind of like Bayou French, right? So the international status of French as a language and France as a country really increases the value. So, in places like Quebec, where they speak French, right? A lot of people, hold that in reverence and they say, oh, yeah, I'm going to go to Quebec or I'm going to go to Montreal, right? So these kind of languages kind of becomes part of their culture and identity of a place where they become very proud of it. And that is something that slows down the shift. Acculturation begins with pressure from a dominant language group. So this could be political, social, and economic. I read in your linguistic autobiographies that some of you, were in ESL class, right? And depending on your teacher, like you really tried hard to speak English. You really tried hard to learn English, and so there's lots of different um, pressures, political pressures, social pressures, economic pressures to learn English. Um, you know, Bilingualism could be a middle stage where you could learn another language and be slowly acculturated to it. Later generations use new language more and more, but when the identity is no longer involved in the first language, acculturation has been completed. So, for example, if you no longer identify as a Chinese American, then you would say that you fully acculturated to the language. So stable bilingualism, when scholars use bilingualism, they talk about using two or more languages fluently. So we're talking about how to create these kinds of instances where bilingual you can speak more than one language fluently in any given environment. So this is where a dominant language could be used for outgroup interactions. A dominated language can be used for in-group interactions and preserves their heritage and identity. So this could be where at home you speak Khmer, but in school you speak English, and this is a way for you to maintain bilingualism. So you're observing the practices of society while you're also preserving your heritage and your identity. So these languages are seen as complementary, not competing, right? You don't really have these competing interests. It just becomes a part of who you are. You're a bilingual individual. But that really does require an attitude change, especially in the United States. Maybe you can write in a discussion board post about ways in which the United States still has a long way to go as far as embracing other languages and learning other languages. A lot of people are still resistant to becoming bilingual. Or they think that if you're bilingual, you don't know a certain language just because you forget a word in one language or another. But it actually means that, being bilingual means that you can speak different languages and you have, a lot of understanding. So why care about languages dying and why care about, English having this hegemony? It's because we want there to be diversity, right? Just like I said earlier, a lot of people care about pandas dying, right? Because we want there to be animal diversity. We don't want to live in a world where there aren't any pandas, right? Because they're so cute. But the same thing for language, right? So languages are diverse and it also represents the identity of a lot of different people. So, the fact that when you lose a language, it's kind of like losing a sense of who you are, right? Languages are also a repository of your history, of your culture. Um, there's certain words or certain expressions that you can only say in a certain language. And it kind of gives you an indication of your heritage. So, for example, if your grandparents or your great grandparents came from Italy, a lot of people would say, like, I'm going to learn Italian because this is part of who I am, right? This is a connection to my roots. So even if you didn't know your grandparents or your great grandparents, this is kind of, you going back to your past and saying, I'm going to reclaim this language. Languages also contribute to the sum of human knowledge, right? So again, like if all of the academic articles are being written in English and presented in English, what does that mean for other articles or other sources of knowledge? There's a really great anecdote. I don't know if it's true, but it talks about these pilots that landed somewhere in rural Australia and they didn't have any food, so they starved to death or they ate each other. I don't know, but there was food all around them in the bushes. They just didn't know, they didn't have any knowledge of the language, they didn't have any knowledge of the culture, that to know like what nuts to eat and what plants are edible. So they just kind of starved, right? So, languages are kind of this repository of human knowledge. Also, languages are interesting. Language kind of indexes kind of who we are as a people, right? How we use language and how we're able to learn different languages, kind of contribute to the diversity of our people. And it's probably why the United States doesn't have an official language. So right now, there's 577 critically endangered languages all around the world. And so, what can we do? How can we preserve them? How can we, revitalize them? The extinct and nearly extinct languages, uh, these are languages that have died in our recent lifetime. So, from Brazil, Cameroon, Argentina, Latvia, many, many, many others have just one speaker. And again, when the last speaker dies, the language dies with it, and the culture dies with it. And it's really, really sad. Like you should really think about this as a panda. So, on a happier note, let's talk about some ways in which we can revitalize a language. How do linguists preserve a language? So, in North Carolina, there is a Cherokee language program. So all of the students, they learn Cherokee as their second language. They're learning English, but they're also being taught Cherokee as well. And so languages can be revived through education, right? In dual language schools, in weekend community schools, right? Heritage community schools. A lot of you, if you're Khmer or Cambodian, you have to go to language class on the weekends, right? And this is a way for you to maintain your language. Now, how did the Cherokee have the funds to sustain a language revitalization program? This is tricky. They actually get most of the funds from neighboring casinos. So having community interest is definitely a plus, but you also have to have the funds, right? Like, how are you going to get the money? A lot of times the government will have these programs and linguists will dedicate their time and efforts to preserving a language, but really you need to put a dollar sign, right? You need to say, okay, we're going to commit to this. And the Cherokee have been very good at this in committing part of their money from the casinos into their language revitalization programs. Welsh. I really like this video from this newscaster. He's pronouncing something in Welsh. But Welsh has been revitalized in that they've taken a strong stance. So every single document in Wales has to be in Welsh first, and then in English, right? Even if the people don't speak Welsh, it has like the government has said, okay, we're Welsh, we want to be able to speak it, and you'll see, it's kind of like a celebrity endorsement, but there's the Welsh national team, and there's a lot of players who are Welsh. So Aaron Ramsey, he used to play for an English soccer team, but he's Welsh descent, and when these players come out and they said, "I'm from Wales, I speak Welsh," this is an indication of how strong, how proud they are of their identity. Gaelic, right? Gaelic, if you go to Ireland, Gaelic is something to where they'll put things in signs, street signs, right? Um, in Gaelic before they put it in English. And a lot of people, you have, if there's a lot of people who are of Irish descent in America, and so it'd be a good idea to learn Gaelic, right? Because it's part of your heritage, and it's also kind of a selling point for when you come to Ireland. It's like we're not only Irish, we have Gaelic as one of our languages. Hawaiian, you know, what's the biggest selling point of revitalizing a language is really tourism, right? A lot of people, when they go to Hawaii, they learn different Hawaiian words because it's cool and it's sexy, right? People don't want to go to Hawaii and speak, and learn English. They want to go to Hawaii and be transported to this exotic location, right? And be able to speak their language. So they'll print Hawaiian words or and say like, oh, in Hawaiian this means this, ignoring the fact that Hawaiian is has been threatened in the past by English, right? So again, we can talk about language endangerment and language revitalization, but we have to recognize the fact in which English has become such this global dominating force, that threatens a lot of these languages. So there's new Disney movies that come out that really promote Samoan, the Kakaloon language, right? So this also helps. You want to create a sense of pride. Again, you want to be able to say like, okay, this person speaks our language, and we identify with them, and that's something to where you can't take away their identity. So, in sum, linguists, we can describe languages, we can document languages, we can also create language resources. So, a lot of, I've worked on creating a language guide for people who live in coastal Carolinas. They have a special dialect, the Outer Banks English. And so, this is something to where you can implement it in the schools. And so, we can teach a dialect curriculum to kind of show the students, this is something to be proud of. This is your heritage. So here are some discussion questions. What are some benefits and drawbacks of having a global language? What are some benefits and drawbacks to that language being English? Are there any drawbacks for you as an English speaker? What would it mean to you if your children didn't speak your first language? What would it mean to you if you couldn't share your favorite books or songs with other people? What are some subtle, implicit ways that people's actions can lead to language extinction? What are some obvious, explicit ways? Should people be made to continue speaking endangered languages to help preserve linguistic diversity? And what policies would you enact to encourage language maintenance? What costs would be reasonable? So there's lots to discuss, and I will see you on the discussion board.